Hi there, welcome back. Grab a cup of something warm and settle in with me for a bit. I'm taking a small step away from the genealogy threads these next few weeks because the season itself keeps tugging at my sleeve. We're standing in that in-between space now, somewhere after the late winter celebrations and just before the first real breath of spring. For me, that's always when Charming of the Plough starts to feel alive again. There's something powerful about the moment just before work begins. Not the frantic rush kind. I mean the slow, intentional pause where you look at the tools that carry your life forward and feel that quiet shift that says, it's almost time. It might surprise some people to hear that there isn't a tidy ancient script for it. Tacitus doesn't hand us a checklist. A quick side note before we go further, there are two ways to pronounce this name. Tacitus with an S sound and Tacitus with a K sound. Both stress the first syllable. The S sound is a common way to pronounce the name. The K sound is based on the original Latin pronunciation. And honestly, both show up in English, but I will be using the Latin pronunciation in my podcasts. I wanted to quickly review that just in case you as the listener are yelling at me for mispronunciation. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming. Venerable Bede, around 672 to 735, most often simply called Bede, was a Benedictine monk, historian, and theologian living in early medieval England. Many people know him as the father of English history, largely because of his work, Ecclesiastical History of the English People. He was a prolific scholar who helped popularize the Anno Domini, or AD, dating system. And for long stretches of early English history, his writings are some of the only surviving windows we have. Bede mentions seasonal observances and springtime customs, though he rarely leaves us clear ritual instructions. What we receive instead are brief references, names of practices, hints of celebrations, fragments that feel more like echoes than manuals. And maybe that's part of the beauty of it. Instead of neat ceremonial scripts preserved in the margins, what reaches us across time are threads woven through story, landscape, and memory. Old myths, seasonal rhythms, archaeological whispers, and those deeply human instincts that keep resurfacing across Northern Europe, whether anyone writes them down or not. Run your fingers along those threads long enough, and you may find them weaving together into feelings and patterns that feel familiar somehow, almost like a memory you didn't know you were carrying. And one of those leads us back to a veiled goddess walking through the land. Tacitus calls her Nerþus. Even filtered through the lens of a Roman writer trying to make sense of unfamiliar customs, something about her comes through with remarkable clarity. She arrives quietly. She's not loud or warlike. She is veiled, carried in a sacred wagon as though the land itself had chosen to move among the people for just a little while. I always linger on that image longer than I expect to. There is a softness to that image that often gets overlooked. The veil becomes more than cloth. It becomes a boundary between what can be understood and what must simply be felt. She is a goddess that doesn't demand attention, yet whose presence is powerful enough that weapons are set aside and communities slow their breath long enough to notice her passing. She arrives among her people not demanding conquest or glory, but acknowledgement of a changing season. Her connection to the Vanir emerges almost naturally when you sit with that imagery long enough. The Vanir move like currents, land, water, cycles, exchange, less like rulers and more like forces you feel in your bones. Linguistically and symbolically, Nerþus and Njord share echoes that scholars have debated for generations. suggesting that what survives in later Norse myth may be only one branch of an older, more fluid tradition. Many of us walking this path today speak of Nerþus as a darker earth mother. Not dark in a frightening way, dark like deep, fertile soil, like the hidden places where seeds rest before deciding to grow. When I spend time with Nerþus energy, I don't sense something ominous. Heavy, yes, but not ominous. More like roots spreading deep beneath the surface, moisture gathering, life preparing itself without needing applause and fanfare. Growth begins in places that are hidden and quiet. When I sit with Nerþus, she doesn't feel distant to me. She feels like the deeper root beneath the Vanir current, the quiet place Freyr's abundance and Freya's fierce sovereignty rise from. In that understanding, she becomes not only an earth mother, but a quiet ancestor to figures whose domains of fertility, power, magic, and sacred exchange reflect the same underlying rhythm. Even Gullveig, whose story burns through the myths like a spark of transformation, begins to make a different kind of sense through that lens. Not destruction, but alchemy. Change moving through the land itself. This interpretation may not sit neatly inside surviving manuscripts, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Pagan traditions have always grown through relationship with the unseen as much as through preserved text. Sometimes myth doesn't explain, it gestures. It invites the reader to listen between the lines. When we look at Nerþus as a hidden root beneath the Vanir, we aren't rewriting mythological history. We are searching the places where myth whispers. Her veil becomes even more meaningful in that light. A veiled goddess does not reveal everything at once. She invites patience. She invites curiosity. She reminds us that understanding unfolds slowly, like a field waking after winter. After her journey and celebrations among the people, she returns to her island to be bathed and retire from public view. The attendants who witnessed her closely are given back to the sacred waters in sacrifice. It's a heavy moment, and I know for many of us it creates distance at first. Yet when I step back from the literal act and listen for the symbolism underneath, what I hear is reciprocity. Something must be offered when the land gives itself fully. The cycle continues because exchange continues. We don't need ancient sacrifices to understand that exchange. Most of us offer time, breath, attention, small things that carry weight when given honestly. And seen this way, Charming of the Plough becomes less about reenacting an ancient procession and more about recognizing when the veiled presence of the land begins to stir again. The plough, or whatever tool stands in its place today, becomes a small echo of that sacred wagon, moving across the surface of the world and asking it to open just a little. There's a moment in Tacitus's account that pulls me in. Not the sacrifice, not even the veil, but the movement. Nerþus doesn't stay hidden in her island grove. She travels into the world of Midgard. She is carried through the land in a wagon drawn by cattle, another tie to the Vanir current, visiting people rather than waiting to be approached. Something about that image feels older than any single text. It feels like memory layered into the bones of the North. The idea that the land itself might decide to move, to cross boundaries, and to remind people that they are never separate from the soil beneath their feet. Long after Tacitus wrote his observations, archaeology begins whispering back to us in ways that feel almost conspiratorial. Ceremonial wagons appear in bog deposits across northern Europe, carefully built and deliberately returned to wet earth and dark water. The Debjerg wagons, Dejbjerg, in Denmark are among the most striking examples. They don't look like everyday farming carts. Their craftsmanship suggests something slower, more intentional, as though they were meant to carry meaning rather than cargo. No inscription tells us outright that these wagons belong to Nerþus, and no surviving voice steps forward to explain exactly how they were used. Yet, when Tacitus's words rest beside the quiet evidence pulled from peat and water, a pattern begins to take shape almost on its own. These were objects built to move, to travel slowly across the land, and eventually to return to the places where earth softens into water. They seem to linger at that threshold where something ordinary becomes something offered, where motion itself becomes part of the ritual language. It's easy to imagine communities watching a sacred vehicle roll through fields and settlements, feeling the landscape shift in subtle ways as it moved, as though the land itself were breathing differently for a little while, inspiring the same hush that Tacitus described, the way weapons fell silent and daily life softened around the passing of a veiled presence. Later Scandinavian imagery adds another faint echo. Ritual vehicles appeared carved into objects and preserved in burial contexts, hinting that the idea of sacred movement did not vanish when Nerthus's name faded from written memory. Instead, it seems to have changed shape, slipping quietly into the background of seasonal rites and processions that may never have been fully written down. When I hold those threads together, the Roman account, the Danish wagons, the lingering sense of sacred movement, the plough starts to feel like more than just a farming tool. It becomes a descendant of that older motion, a smaller, humbler vehicle that carries intention across the surface of the earth. Each time a plough breaks soil, it repeats a gesture that feels strangely ceremonial, moving slowly, opening ground, asking the land to respond. Even today, when many of us live far from fields, that symbolism lingers. The tool we pick up at the start of a new season, whatever it may be, becomes our own quiet procession. And seen this way, Charming of the Plough is less about reconstructing a lost ritual and more about recognizing a rhythm that never quite disappeared. The land moves, we move with it. The tools we carry become companions in that shared journey. As the image of sacred movement begins to fade into the background, another small thread surfaces, this time from early England, recorded by a monk who was likely watching older customs slip gently out of reach. Bede writes of a month called Solmonoth, Solmo with an accent and a thorn, describing it simply as a time when cakes were offered to the gods. I wish someone would offer me cakes. He doesn't linger on the details, and though it would be awesome if he had, maybe it is better that he didn't. No ritual instructions survive. No descriptions of processions or veiled figures. Just a brief note, almost casual, as though he assumed his readers already understood what that season felt like. There's something beautifully incomplete about that record. Instead of giving us a script to follow, it leaves us with an impression, a sense that late winter carried a mood of preparation, a pause before movement, a moment when people acknowledged the unseen forces that would shape the coming year long before the first seed ever touched soil. Placed beside the story of Nerthus, Solmonoth feels less like a separate tradition and more like a quiet echo of the same rhythm. The land begins to stir. People respond by offering something back, not out of fear or obligation, but out of relationship. For many of us living far from the climates of early England or Scandinavia, February can feel crowded with observances. Dieseblot, Imbolc, Lunar New Year, Mardi Gras, the slow turning of winter festivals that ask for reflection more than action. The energy of Charming of the Plough often settles more comfortably in early March, when the first real thaws soften the ground and planning begins to take shape. It becomes less about copying a historical date and more about listening for the moment when the year quietly shifts from dreaming into doing. Seen through that lens, the plough itself starts to widen in meaning. In earlier centuries, it may have cut furrows through fields, yet the spirit behind it speaks to any tool that prepares the future. A loom waiting for its first thread, a set of carving knives resting beside unfinished wood, a laptop glowing softly before a new project begins. Even car keys signifying the movement towards jobs, education, and even adventures. Each one stands at the edge of possibility, much like the offerings bead recorded. Simple gestures that acknowledge the turning of a cycle without needing to explain every step. Whatever opens the path ahead becomes part of the ritual. When we charm the plough today, we step into that same space between stillness and motion. The ritual becomes less about reenacting the past and more about recognizing that moment when intention gathers itself, when the land and perhaps something within us begins to move again. Hidden somewhere beneath all of these stories, the veiled procession, the quiet offerings of Solmanoth, the slow movement of sacred wagons, sits a question that doesn't always get spoken aloud. If the land gives itself so freely, what does it ask of us in return? Today, the idea of sacrifice in the manner Tacitus describes doesn't sit well with many people. Its harshness might even discourage those of us modern practitioners from experiencing the connection with Nerþus in the first place. Yet when you step back from the literal act and listen for the symbolism underneath, another layer begins to emerge. The land offers presence, peace, and renewal. The people respond with sacrifice, not as punishment, but as completion. Not blood, not fear, just presence. A cycle closes and reciprocity is observed. Something is returned so that something else may begin. Sacrifice can look like choosing care over convenience, tending a space that has been neglected, or dedicating time to a craft that shaped the world in quiet ways. Pausing long enough to acknowledge the unseen relationships that carry us forward. The ideas shift from loss into relationship. Giving something back becomes less about obligation and more about balance, a way of recognizing that growth for us humans rarely happens in isolation. When Charming of the Plough is viewed through that lens, the ritual begins to feel deeply personal. A person who might set aside a few minutes to clean and bless the objects they rely on, whispering a hope for steadiness and creativity in the months ahead. Another might pour a libation onto soil that has carried them through winter, marking the moment when planning turns into action. Even in a group, each person approaching the altar and presenting their offerings while having their tools blessed, may feel as if they are alone in the rite. A feeling that they are entirely alone with the goddess and are blessed for it. It's both humbling and powerful. These gestures need not be dramatic. In many ways, the quiet offerings mirror the veiled presence of Nerþus herself, unseen by most, yet felt in the shift of energy that follows. Viewed this way, the plough is not only an agricultural tool, it becomes a symbol of willingness, a readiness to step into the work of living, while remembering that the land, the spirits, and the unseen currents of the world are moving alongside us. And perhaps that is where the true charm lies, not in commanding the earth to yield, but in entering the season with humility and curiosity, trusting that the relationship between people and place is still unfolding. Somewhere along the way, the plough stopped belonging only to farmers. The shift didn't happen all at once. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, as the world changed and people carried the old rhythms into new kinds of work. The plough still remains a symbol of preparation and willingness, of opening pathways where none existed before a readiness to step into life, even when the fields themselves disappear from daily life. In older communities, the plough marked the beginning of the working year. Soil was turned not just to plant seeds. The act carried intention and acknowledged that survival depended on partnership between human effort and the living landscape. Today, that same gesture can take many forms. A musician tuning their instrument before the first rehearsal of spring. A craftsperson sharpening tools that have rested through winter's slower pace. Someone opening a fresh notebook, feeling that quiet anticipation before words begin to gather. Each action carries the same underlying motion, preparing the ground where something new might grow. Seen through an animist lens, tools are never entirely silent. They remember how they could have been used. They hold the weight of past seasons and the promise of future ones. Charming the plough becomes an act of recognition, an acknowledgement that the objects we rely on participate in our stories as much as we do. There's also a certain kindness in widening the symbol this way. Not everyone has access to farmland or traditional seasonal labor, yet everyone stands at the edge of renewal at some point during the year. Early March often feels like that threshold for many of us. The first real thaw, the return of longer light, the sense that plans begin shifting into motion. Placing charming of the plough here allows the ritual to meet the climate and rhythms of modern life, rather than forcing it into a calendar shaped by different landscapes. When people bless the tools of their trade, they aren't claiming ownership over the future. They are entering into conversation with it. A simple gesture, a touch, a whispered intention, a moment of stillness, becomes a way of aligning personal work with the wider movement of the land. What once guided oxen through soil now guides creativity, craftsmanship, healing, and study. The plough lives wherever something is shaped with care. Perhaps that is why this ritual continues to resonate. It invites us to see our labor, whatever that looks like, not as separate from the sacred, but as one of the ways the sacred chooses to move through us. When all of these threads settle together, the veiled procession, the quiet offerings of late winter, the slow blessing of the tools that shape our lives, Nerþus begins to feel less like a distant historical figure and more like a presence that still moves beneath the surface of the year. The goddess travels in subtler ways now, moving through seasons, through memory, through the relationships we choose to nurture. What remains constant is the invitation to participate. Not as spectators watching an old story unfold, but as companions walking alongside it, shaping the year with intention, honoring the unseen work that makes renewal possible. A plough drawn across soil, a hand resting on a well-worn tool, a quiet offering placed outside before sunrise. Each gesture echoes the ancient procession without needing to recreate it. And perhaps that is the true charm of the plough. See what I did there? It reminds us that beginnings rarely arrive with fanfare. They arrive quietly, veiled in possibility, waiting for someone to recognize that the land and the spirit within it has already begun to move. Even if the idea of land is symbolic rather than physical, the rhythm still reaches us. As the season turns and the work of beginning settles into everyday life, I sometimes imagine Nerþus returning to her island, the wagon slowing, the veil falling softly back into place. The land grows quiet again, not empty, but full in a different way, leaving behind only the subtle changes it stirred along the way. The presence that moved so openly through the world withdraws into stillness, replaced by a new sense that change is truly coming. And there's something deeply comforting in that image. Renewal doesn't need to stay loud or visible to remain real. Seeds don't continue breaking open once they've taken root. They slip back into the hidden work of becoming. For many of us walking this path today, this moment can feel like standing at the edge of a threshold. The tools have been blessed, intentions have been set, and the plough, whatever shape it takes in your life, has traced its first quiet line through the year ahead. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next. The ritual breathes out and life moves forward. As you step into the coming season, take a moment to notice the quiet shifts around you. The light lingering a little longer, the ground loosening. Maybe your ideas that have been waiting patiently begin to stretch toward the surface of realization. The goddess may be veiled again, but her presence remains in every act of care, every tool lifted with intention, every breath taken before the work begins. So wherever your plough leads you this year, into art, study, healing, or even simple daily living, may it carry a little of that ancient rhythm with it. When the season grows heavy or uncertain, remember that the cycle always turns. The veil lifts, the veil falls, and somewhere beneath it all, the earth continues to move. May the land meet you gently, and may your work feel rooted and alive. Thank you for sitting with me today as we explored a pagan practice that is both beautiful and rewarding. Next time, we'll wander into the vernal equinox and celebrations that gather around it before returning to our discussions of the genealogy threads and continuing through the Jotnar. My lovely little heathens and heathen friendlies, have a beautiful week as winter loosens its grip. Don't be fooled by false springs and cabin fever. Keep those layers on for a little bit longer. It will soon be time for a changing of the guard. So keep those eyes open for signs and enjoy the last of our yearly restful period. Remember your connection to the divine And in the middle of everything swirling through the world right now, don't forget to find your sacred breath.